Good afternoon. My name is Aidan Poling, and the title of my presentation is The 49th Life, Washington as a Noble Greek and Roman. Washington's portrayal in biography and eulogy in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was shaped by the prominent role virtue played in American political thought, the high esteem that the founding generation had for the great men of classical antiquity, and the importance of classical literature as a model par excellence of historical and biographical writing. While many eulogies of Washington demonstrate this, for the purposes of this conference, we will focus on the landmark biography of Washington, written by Parson Mason Weems in 1800. Weems's biography, titled The Life of George Washington, with curious anecdotes equally honorable to himself and exemplary to his countrymen, is famous due to its invention of the myth of Washington not being able to tell a lie about cutting down his father's cherry tree. The text is, as the title suggests, explicitly didactic in nature. It's not only filled with classical references, but also borrows much of its structure and themes from classical biographers and historians like Plutarch and Suetonius. Weems's biography is also fascinating because it endeavors to simultaneously display the relatable habits we might expect to find in Plutarch's life of Pericles, while also forging the legend fit to match those of mythical founding fathers like Theseus or Romulus. The American founding generation was convinced that virtue was the bedrock of good governance. In a 1775 letter to James Warren, Samuel Adams argued that while we may look up to armies for our defense, virtue is our best security. It is not possible that any state should long remain free, where virtue is not supremely honored. John Adams shared his cousin's opinion, stating in a letter to Mercy Otis Warren that public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. These sentiments would not be at all out of place in Plato or Cicero, given the ancients' obsession with virtue. To impart this civic virtue, the founding generation turned to the very same source from which they had first learned of them, classical biography and history. In A General Idea of the College of Morania, William Smith noted that the youth are sent into the world well acquainted with the history of Greece and Rome, which may justly be called the history of heroism, virtue, and patriotism, and then emphasized the importance of Plutarch as a source for this history. Adams repeated the sentiment in 1790 when he stated that Polybius and Plutarch and Sallust, as sources of wisdom as well as Roman history, must not be forgotten. Plutarch was by far the most well-read classical author in early America, and his emphasis on biography as a didactic form of writing had a direct influence on later American writing. By expressing these sentiments, the American founders were mirroring those expressed by Plutarch himself, who noted in his Life of Pericles that virtuous deeds produce in the minds of mere readers about them an emulation and eagerness that may lead on to imitation. Crucially for our purposes, classical biography does not focus for Plutarch simply on glorious exploits, since they do not always furnish us with the clearest discoveries of men's virtues or vices. Rather, Plutarch relied on matters of less moment, in expression or jest, to inform his readers of the characters and inclination of his subjects. This approach to biography was one which Mason Weems would intentionally mirror in his biography of Washington. Weems's utilization of classical references and tropes is highly significant since it demonstrates that it was not just the educated elite, but also the common man that was conversant with the classics. Weems explicitly marketed his book not to the educated planter or mercantile classes, but rather poor Southerners, though the appeal of the work quickly spread throughout the country. Weems realized before many other Americans that significant money could be made by marketing a product with a low margin on a wide scale. This strategy would bear fruit, and in the ensuing decades following its first printing in 1800, the Weems biography would be widely reprinted and become the most popular work of biographical writing in early American history. Throughout the work, Weems emphasized the role of virtue in the success of Washington. He also explicitly attempted to make his work didactic and made a point of not only including the great moments of Washington's life, but also small revealing anecdotes, many of which he must have surely invented whole cloth in order to elucidate Washington's character and make it easier for his readers to relate to Washington. By engaging in these practices, Weems was explicitly modeling himself off of biographers like Plutarch, as well as moral philosophers such as Cicero and Plato, who perceive personal virtue as the key to good political leadership. The direct influence of Plutarch on Weems is clear. Weems called for an examination of Washington's private life, since it is private virtue that lay the foundation of all human excellence. Williams believed it imperative for people to perceive Washington not just as a demigod in storm and war, but also as the laborious farmer, widow's husband, the orphan's father, the poor man's friend. This was especially necessary since while future generals and presidents might find a description focused on Williams's great deeds useful, the vast majority of individuals required an exemplar that was a more down to earth, since most individuals would never have the opportunity to direct the storm of war or ravish the ears of a deeply listening Senate. Thus, in very Plutarchian fashion, Williams inserted the discussion of private virtue as a way of making Washington relatable to even America's children, since to them his public virtue is nothing and his private virtue is everything. Williams's biography would prove to be very effective in instilling the importance of virtue in American youth. The most noteworthy case of this is that of Abraham Lincoln. In one address given on the eve of the Civil War, Lincoln recalled how he read Williams during his childhood and took inspiration from the feats of bravery and patriotism depicted within. The historian James McPherson has argued that Williams's biography of Washington was perhaps the only exposure Lincoln had to the mythos of the American Revolution during his childhood. Examples of Washington's private virtue abound in Williams beyond the cherry tree anecdote. One such demonstration of private virtue was Washington not requiring help to put his affairs in order upon being taken fatally ill on a Friday, since no letters of consequence were unanswered and all of his books were updated through the following Tuesday. Another example of Washington's private virtue was his refusal of shares in 2 Potomac ferry companies for fear of being considered mercenary by his fellow citizens. The importance of being didactic regarding Washington's character is illustrated by how Williams structured his book. While he spent the first 173 pages discussing Washington's life and death, Williams did not end the book there. Rather, he provided a further 4 chapters and 43 pages to discuss Washington's piety, benevolence, industry, and patriotism, and included many anecdotes attesting to Washington's private virtue, such as those just discussed, while also comparing Washington favorably to other men of note. Washington's virtues were contrasted against those of classical figures such as Caesar, Cicero, Alcibiades, Scipio Africanus, Socrates, and Leonidas, as well as familiar but flawed characters from the American Revolution like Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton, Benedict Arnold, and Charles Lee. Williams also borrowed forms and tropes from ancient authors like Thucydides and Plutarch. Williams began his work by conveying an anecdote involving 2 Americans meeting with Napoleon. When Napoleon inquires after Washington, the Americans respond by saying that the last they heard of him, he was well. Napoleon notes that, of course, this is the case, since Washington can never be otherwise than well. Posterity shall talk of him with reverence as a founder of a great empire, when my name shall be the lost in the vortex of a great revolution. The almost certainly fictional interchange seems directly based off of a similar dialogue relayed to us by Suetonius. Suetonius begins his life of Caesar by noting how the Roman dictator Sulla had forced Caesar to go in hiding. When Caesar's friends finally convinced Sulla to relent, he did so only grudgingly, noting that in Caesar there is more than one Marius. By beginning his work as Suetonius does, with a description of his subject by a noted contemporary, Williams lent himself the unquestionably eminent authority of Napoleon on the subject of great men, while at the same time obliquely placing Washington into conversation with the grandeur of the classical past. Williams clearly intended to make Washington a relatable figure so that individuals could emulate his example. However, he also worked to forge Washington into the sort of mythical founding father that Romulus was for Rome and Theseus for Athens. One way that Williams made Washington appear as a providential figure was by providing an account of a prophetic dream experienced by Washington's mother to foreshadow Washington's later greatness. The use of prophetic dreams was an incredibly common trope in ancient writing and is especially prevalent in the works of Plutarch, Herodotus, and Xenophon. Williams describes a dream experienced by Washington's mother, wherein the child Washington is playing at plowing the fields when his mother's roof catches on fire. Washington called for a ladder and climbs up and begins to try to put out the fire with a gourd. This proved ineffective. Then an old man, holding an iron lightning rod and a wooden shoe, appeared. He offered Washington the shoe to use to put out the fire. Upon receiving the shoe, Washington redoubled his efforts and soon extinguished the fire. After this, Washington looked rather sad at the great harm that had been done. But after deep thought, urged his mother to not be sad, since with his family's consent, they together would create a far better roof than that which had been there before. Weems then proceeded to interpret the dream and noted that the fire represents the revolution, the ineffective gourd, the short terms of service for American soldiers, the old man, Franklin, the wooden shoe, the French which Franklin brought to the American side, and the new roof, the new nation which Washington would work to create. While this dream of Washington's mother is reminiscent of similar dreams experienced by the likes of Alexander's mother, Olympias, and Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, it also undoubtedly lent an air of destiny to Washington that made him appear somehow providentially ordained to save and lead his country. Weems, in his mythologizing of Washington, also included frequent invocations of Greco-Roman demigods, heroes, and deities. Generally, the purpose of these allusions was to portray Washington as possessing some type of superhuman characteristic. Weems noted that Washington was so agile as a youth that swift-footed Achilles could scarcely have matched his speed. Weems described Washington's 1753 diplomatic journey to the French station in the Ohio Valley as disagreeable and dangerous as Hercules himself could have desired, thereby demonstrating Washington's bravery and desire to prove himself. Weems also regularly invoked Zeus/Jupiter in reference to Washington. Within the first few pages of his work, Weems described Washington as Jupiter the Conservator, the friend and benefactor of man. During the Battle of Trenton, Washington and his soldiers advanced upon the Hessians like a stream of lightning. Weems even inserted Washington into the Battle of Cowpens, a battle which Washington did not directly participate, by noting that it was the swords of Washington which routed Tarleton's troops and produced a sound like a peal of thunder. The use of Zeus/Jupiter's aspect of thunder and lightning by Weems described Washington's military prowess. After having begun his work comparing to Washington to Jupiter the Conservator, would have strengthened the connection that Weems's readers made between Washington and Zeus/Jupiter. Weems's biography of Washington underlines the central role that classics played when it came to early American hero worship. Drawing on classical models and Plutarch in particular, Weems strove to elucidate Washington's human virtues, even as he helped cement the concept of Washington as a semi-divine pater patriae. These two differing images of Washington would prove enduring and are present in later representations of Washington, including the Houdon, Washington, Canova Washington, and Grinnell Washington, as well as Antonio Bermudi's Apotheosis of Washington. I had meant to include images of each in this presentation, but unfortunately, due to technical constraints, I was unable to do so. I would encourage you, though, to look up each. Thank you for listening and have a great day.